Let's hear it for Carl Bernstein. We're so honored to feature you here this evening, Carl Bernstein, and joined by two of the most respected voices in journalism today, John Dickerson and Katie Couric. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Community Programs and Engagement here at the Aspen Institute, and we're delighted to partner with our friend Kitty Boone and Aspen Film to bring this conversation to you this evening. Thank you. These remarkable journalists have spent their careers demonstrating the integrity, courage, and commitment to truth that are essential to a free press and a healthy democracy. We are grateful to have them with us this evening. Please join me in giving a warm Aspen welcome to Carl Bernstein, John Dickerson, and Katie Couric. Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, it is wonderful to be here tonight. I have to apologize in advance. I have a terrible summer cold, which sucks, but whatever. Anyway, this year marks, as many of you know, the 50th anniversary of All the President's Men, a film that not only became one of the greatest journalism movies ever made, but it also helped shape how generations of Americans think about the role of a free press in our democracy. Tonight, we're going to look back at the remarkable reporting that inspired the film, explore why its story continues to resonate half a century later, and discuss what it can teach us about journalism today at a moment when the profession and the public's trust in it are facing enormous challenges. So, Carl and John, welcome. I'm so happy you're here, and I'm so excited for this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. I booked Carl myself, and I'm very proud of that. No charge, Aspen. Anyway, before we dive into the film, Carl, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about you and Bob Woodward, or Woodstein, as Ben Bradley would say. You two were such a study in contrast, according to Robert Redford, who described you as, quote, two guys that couldn't be more different. Different religions, different politics, different everything. And yet they had to work together, and they didn't like each other very much. Is that how you see it? Talk to us about the dynamic. And I'd love to hear, Carl, about how your dynamic with Bob has changed over these 5 decades.
Well, certainly at the beginning, we were quite suspicious of each other. During the first period of the Watergate break-in, I had already had 12 years experience in the newspaper business. I'd gone to work at the Washington Star, a great afternoon paper, when I was 16 years old. Woodward had no experience, as I was often pointing out to him.
Well, he was pretty new to the post, right, when you guys teamed up?
Yes, he was. He had applied. He had come out of the Navy. He was an officer in the Navy, didn't know quite what to do. He didn't want to go to law school, he decided. So he thought he'd try journalism. He applied at the Washington Post for a job. The city editor said, no, you don't know anything. Go out to the counties, work for a weekly newspaper, come back and see me. In a year, he did. He came back, and right away, he started getting his byline on page 1. And that I noticed.
That bugged you.
But we both came into the office on the day of the Watergate break-in, and we were told by the city editor to go to work. Bob went down to the courthouse where the burglars were being arraigned. I started calling down to Florida to the wives and families of the burglars, trying to learn more about who these people were who had broken into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And they all seemed to have CIA connections. And so we worked on that first story together. And the next day we came in, it was a Sunday, and then we really started to work together in earnest. And right away, I think each of us realized that the other had some abilities that perhaps I lacked some and he lacked some. And very quickly we came to have a kind of complementary relationship, a little different than the kind of stereotypical writing about the two of us. That in all of these years, we each often play the role expected of the other. There's a myth that I'm the better writer. Sometimes Woodward will write brilliantly stuff that I could never write. That my way of questioning a source is maybe a little more laid back than his, then sometimes he'll lay back. But the real thing is how close we became very quickly. And we knew that the reputation of the Washington Post was on the line, that this was a story of awesome reality of the President of the United States, who clearly was a criminal President of the United States. And today we're closer than ever. We're joined at the hip. We talk to each other a couple times a week.
Really? That's so great.
I've just been down to Washington to stay with Bob a couple times in the last couple months. And no, as he said the other day, he said, that our lives at a certain juncture were joined. And it's been that way ever since. And we talk particularly about journalism.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty to talk about today, which we'll get to, I promise. But former Washington Post executive editor Lynn Downey recently said Robert Redford was fine as Woodward. I thought he was really good as Woodward, personally. But Dustin Hoffman was Carl Bernstein. He was amazing. Do you agree? Do you feel that Dustin Hoffman? No?
Look, the really great thing about the movie of All the President's Men, and maybe we'll set the table with this a little bit, is that it is about the process of reporting. It is a primer on reporting. And what you see is not Bob's personal life, not my personal life. You see our interaction as reporters, but what this movie is about is how you go about reporting a story under the most difficult of circumstances. And I think the reason for its longevity is that fact. It's not about Bob and me, really. It's about,
the process.
That's what those guys did. That's how this story was broken. That is what the best obtainable version of the truth, a phrase that Woodward and I started to use very early when people would say, well, what is this reporting you're doing on the front page? And we'd say, well, it's the best obtainable version of the truth. That's what the movie is about.
John, how old were you when All the President's Men came out?
I was 8.
And I knew both his parents.
But, it's so interesting for those of you all who don't know. I mean, John's life has been steeped in journalism. Will you talk about your family? Because, most 8-year-olds probably hadn't heard of it. But I think a young John Dickerson might have heard of this film.
Yeah.
8.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was certainly and the Nixon presidency. Carl will remember this, but the night that Nixon went down to visit the students protesting on the mall, he placed a call earlier that evening to 2 people. Helen Thomas was one of them, and my mother was the other. She was a reporter at that time for NBC. He'd had a bit to drink, and he was trying to convince her that he really did care about these kids, which she had asked him a question about during the press conference earlier that day. But I just want to pick up on something that Carl said, which is the story broke, and immediately he got on the phone. To me, the movie is about phones and notebooks and patience. I mean, a lot of it's hard almost to imagine. There would be times where you'd be working sources and calling, and there would be multiple days that would go by. I mean, now when a story breaks, if you don't get an update in 10 minutes, you get antsy.
I mean, that's so true, because I rewatched some of the film last night, and I was so struck by the rotary phones, the painstaking journalism that the 2 guys sitting in the Library of Congress going over all these different cards about what books had been taken out
By the White House Library.
Right. I mean, it was insane, and I thought, good Lord, this kind of gumshoe reporting.
And that's why when I started out at Time, they were superstars, who, it wasn't that they were superstars who reported a certain way. It's because they reported a certain way that they became superstars. I mean, the city editor assigned you the first story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, it wasn't, oh, this is a huge scandal, let's get our 2 people who are fully established to go do this. It was the basics of the trade that served them through the whole thing, and that's what drew me to wanting to participate in the basics of the trade.
Before the movie even came out, the Associate Dean of Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism jokingly said, God help us when Robert Redford makes that movie, because he knew it would inspire a whole new generation of young people to become journalists. I say, God help us when Dustin Hoffman makes that movie too. But he was right. I mean, talk about Carl and John. Well, you were so little at the time, but Carl, talk about the deluge, the impact of young people who wanted to go into journalism. I was one of them, because when this film came out, it was
I
the
worked
year.
with you.
That's right. Oh yeah, but don't tell that story. That's a funny story. Well, actually, it's funnier for me and less so for Carl. But remember, he remembers it differently. Okay, I'll tell it really quickly, just parenthetically. So I was working at ABC News in Washington. It was my first job out of college. I went to UVA like John did, and much later than I did. And I was a desk assistant. I was a grunt. You know, I was basically answering phones and making coffee. Well, guess what? They hired Carl Bernstein to be the Washington bureau chief of ABC News. I remember him strutting around in this royal blue corduroy suit. Do you remember that suit?
Yes, yes. I also remember how unfit I was for being a bureau chief. I was terrible
Anyway,
at it.
but Carl was great and very nice. But when CNN started, I was asked to be a young employee of, one of the first employees of CNN. And I went to Carl's office and I said, Mr. Bernstein, I've been offered this entry level job at CNN. I hope you understand. I think this is a great opportunity. And do you remember the story differently? He goes, Katie, why would you want to go to the minor leagues when you're already in the major leagues? And I said, yes, Mr. Bernstein, but I think I need to learn how to play baseball first. You remember that?
Now I do.
Anyway, all right. So talk about, though, how many young people were so inspired, not only by your book, obviously, but by this movie, and how it shaped the journalism profession, Carl.
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that Watergate has such permanence in the culture because of the movie more than the book. I think we can assume that with just the book, the journalistic aspect would have gone by. And so that what the movie has done is it in some way has enshrined this tale of reporters doing something that was unique in ways in our history because of the dimensions of the story. And I think we can also over-glamorize in this discussion a little bit. I mean, the reason I would hope that so many people were drawn to the profession after seeing the movie or reading the book or knowing what had happened is because it was an essential element of our democracy, of our democratic process. And that hopefully people who were drawn to be involved in this process was about news, was about the best obtainable version of the truth, was not about the glamorous figure of Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman, but rather was about what was up there on the screen, which was a lot of hard, painstaking work. And incidentally, what really is key in the movie, and when you see it tonight, some of you will watch the movie, was that really on the first day, we decided, and I said to Woodward, we have to go visit people who work for Richard Nixon at the Committee for the Re-election of the President, at the White House. We need to go to their homes and knock on their doors. We need to find out who these people are, get a list of them, and because we're not going to get any information if we go to their offices. And you know, that you would think, oh, well, yeah, let's go to their office would be the way most people, I think, would say, and no, they're not going to tell you a damn thing. They're going to be subject to pressure. So from the beginning, we make that decision to go knock on people's doors. We get doors slammed in our faces. And that is the leitmotif of the movie. And
Reminds me of Spotlight,
it's-
when all those reporters from
Yeah.
the Boston Globe did
Right.
that and just went door to door to door. And John, I'm curious. It's so funny because John and I are kind of dueling moderators right now. He wants to
You
jump
got the
in.
microphone.
But talk about sort of how Watergate and the movie, obviously your upbringing with your incredible mom, especially, I guess, and your dad was a journalist too. Yes,
No, he wasn't.
just so it was your mom.
Just mom. Yeah.
But how did this kind of feed your ambitions to want to be a journalist?
Well, two things also. Another thing that's key in the movie and doesn't happen as much anymore is second sources for things. I mean, the amount of work that's put into making sure you had multiple sources, that you didn't just run with something the minute somebody whispered it to you. But one of the biggest things that changed, which affected the presidency when I covered it specifically in covering the White House and then in writing about the presidency, is the relationship between the press and its job as a watchdog of the presidency really changed after Watergate. And all of us who were journalists covering White Houses had a baseline skepticism that was basically set by you guys, which is that, after the lies of Vietnam and the lies of Watergate and the criminal activity of a president in the Oval Office, all journalists I remember my bureau chief telling me, and I feel like this just comes right out of your experience, was he thought, however skeptical you are of a White House, just add 25% more skepticism. And we were all, the way you competed was being more skeptical about a White House. And what you learn when you cover a White House is, no, actually, you can be even more skeptical. And the poor people have to cover the Trump administration. The dial has spun beyond its edge. But
it's important to remember that when we were doing these stories for the first few months at the Washington Post, we were out there pretty much by ourselves. And what we were putting in the paper was not believed by most of the Washington press corps, nor, by our older colleagues on the national staff of the Washington Post. They were saying, what the hell is this story? Who are these guys? They're on the local staff, and this is a local burglary? What's this all about?
Oh, heaven help any reporter who reports on the White House, and it's not, what did the White House reporters think of what you were doing?
Well, they thought it was garbage. But also, it's important to realize that after a little while, some great reporters not at the Washington Post got on the story. Cy Hirsch at the New York Times, Sandy Smith at Time Magazine. And it gave what we were doing a legitimacy that we might otherwise not have had, being 28 and 29 years old at the time, and all of a sudden reporting on this terrible conspiracy led by the President of the United States.
Last week at an event at the Nixon Library, Vice President J.D. Vance said that if Watergate happened today, it would be a, quote, 12-hour news story. And the idea that it would have taken down a presidency is crazy, end quote. He also drew a parallel with the deep state that took down Nixon, quote, deep state that took down Nixon and what happened to Trump during his first term. Go ahead, you guys. What's your reaction to that?
First of all, the observation of it might have been a 2-week story and then disappeared.
12-hour.
A 12-hour story and then disappeared might well be right. We live in a different political culture, the likes of which we have never seen in the history of this country. And that is not just about Donald Trump, it's about the people of the country that might not have an interest of more than a few hours about the story, no matter what the contours of it. But more important than the fact that Vance is so ignorant of what happened in Watergate, the idea that the deep state brought Nixon down is preposterous, outrageous, untrue. Nixon was brought down by Republicans. The real heroes of Watergate are courageous Republicans.
That's right.
Who voted for the articles of impeachment in the House of Representatives against Richard Nixon, and indeed, a delegation of Republican leaders led by Barry Goldwater, the presidential candidate of his party in 1964. All of the Republican leaders, 2 days before Nixon resigned, went down to the Oval Office to see Nixon. And Woodward and I, when writing The Final Days, a second book we did about the last year of Nixon's presidency, went to see Goldwater, and he told us exactly what happened on this occasion. He poured a big bottle of big scotches for each of us, and we sat down in his apartment, Goldwater, and he said he pulled out a diary, and he then proceeded to describe what had happened. He had led this delegation to the Oval Office. He sat across from Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, and Nixon said to Goldwater, as the head of the delegation, they were there to tell Nixon, actually, that he needed to leave office, that he was guilty, and that he needed to resign for the good of the country. And Nixon, of course, was trying to stay in office. And Nixon said to Goldwater, well, Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate for being acquitted of high crimes and misdemeanors? And Nixon fully expected that Goldwater and these other leaders would tell him, Mr. President, you probably will have eventually enough votes to prevail and you'll be able to stay in office. And Goldwater looked, and he's reading to Woodward and me from his diary. Goldwater looked at Nixon and he said, Mr. President, right now you may have 4 or 5 votes for acquittal, and you will never have mine. And that was the end of Richard Nixon's presidency, and he decided that night he must resign. And so if the current Vice President of the United States is that ignorant about what happened in Watergate and why Republicans also look at the role of the Supreme Court in Watergate, led by a Chief Justice appointed by Richard Nixon, who he expected would say, oh, Mr. President, you don't have to give up these secret tape recordings that you made. And the Chief Justice of the United States, Warren Burger, organized the court saying, we have to have a unanimous decision that the president has to give up these tapes, that no one is above the law in this country, including the President of the United States. Now, let's look at the current Supreme Court and compare these two events by Republican-led entities. And you really have to ask yourself, well, what is the most important decision in some ways that this Supreme Court has made relative to Donald Trump? And it was the January 6th case, which had been sent to the Supreme Court by the Court of Appeals. And the Chief Justice and the majority of the court decided that indeed that Nixon, who had been indicted by a grand jury in the January 6th attempt to steal the election.
Trump, yeah.
Trump. What did I say?
You said Nixon, but that's okay.
There you go. There you go. that Trump had been indicted, and the Supreme Court in Trump's case decided it would not send that indictment and the trial back to the district court, that Trump did not have to face a trial. And as a result, he was probably elected president when he would, in all likelihood, I think we can assume, if that trial had taken place and the facts as developed by the special prosecutor, that Trump, in all likelihood, would have been finished.
What I would add is if the deep state took down Richard Nixon, the deep state was his mouth, because the smoking gun tape on which he is caught ordering the CIA to tell the FBI to stop investigating is the definition of evidence that is so strong it's irrefutable. And so that ended up being among the things that turned the tide in the end, and the Republican senatorial count was so low. So if J.D. Vance is suggesting that this piece of evidence wouldn't have been as powerful, it is in line with some of the things we've seen from the actual administration we have here today. So when you have the head of the Department of Homeland Security saying that video that shows the murders, the killings in Minnesota in a live interview with Jake Tapper, is arguing about what you can plainly see on video, the attempt to rewrite history in the present. It shouldn't surprise you that they're rewriting history in the past. The other thing that struck me about the delegation that went to go see Nixon is it contains Goldwater, who was supposedly the most crazy conservative thing you'd ever seen when he got the 64 nomination, and Hugh Scott, who wrote a book called Come to the Party, which was about, let's get more moderate as Republicans. You had just an entirely different political structure then, where there were moderate Republicans, and there were a fair number of them in the party. And Barry Goldwater, who was this conservative, had a different set of views, both his Western upbringing, his time in the service, which were distinct from the party itself. And right now, we have a party that is basically determined by the behavior of a single president. The final thing I would say is, you know, J.D. Vance isn't just some pundit. He is a vice president of the United States who has taken an oath to the Constitution and is responsible for the moral upkeep and stewardship of the constitutional system. And so for him to say, oh, you know, Watergate, Schmodergate, about a president who ordered the CIA to tell the FBI to stop investigating a break-in into the Democratic headquarters, which was an effort to meddle with a free and fair election, for him to say, it's no big deal, he's making that claim as a constitutional officer. It's like the assistant to a priest who's about to perform a wedding saying, you know, Hugh Hefner's, his view on monogamy really has some good points to it.
But also, don't you think it says something, though, about the current news landscape and that people have almost become inured to the corruption and the misdeeds of this current administration?
Now, that's where I think we need to go here. We can't talk about Donald Trump without talking about the people of this country. That it seems in all of the polls have shown consistently that something like 80 to 90% of people who identify themselves as Republicans have embraced virtually everything that this president of the United States has done. And we keep reading about how, quote, only 35 or 36% of the people in this country support Donald Trump, given what he has done in this first year of his second term as president of the United States and the extraordinary nature of it. It's astonishing, I think, in some ways, that percentage of people in this country would continue to support Donald Trump. So we got to look at it, and at the time of Nixon, most people in the country believed it was time for Nixon to go, that we have nothing comparable to that.
I was just going to say, John,
today.
you've made a point that for all of his flaws, Nixon ultimately believed, and this, I think, herein lies the rub. He ultimately believed in the democratic norms that govern the relationship between the White House and a free press.
And he was a crook and caught on tape being a crook. So, you know, that's obviously the main thing. But as I was doing some work, I went back and looked at a couple of different things. First of all, in 1960, he thinks that basically Kennedy monkeyed with votes in Illinois and Texas. And he had enough evidence to make some noise about it. And he decided not to. Now, did he believe in his heart that he'd lost? Who knows? But he knew that to survive, some norms needed to be maintained. So when he concedes, he says, you know what happens in American elections? We fight, and then there's a victor, and we all get behind them. Now, he may not have believed that in his heart of hearts, but he knew that to survive in politics, he had to say that out loud. The current president doesn't believe in that. In the famous moment where he says to Bill Pierpoint, I think it was, of CBS, it's in a press conference, and Pierpoint says, I gather that our questions irritate you. And he goes on a bit of a diatribe, and he says, you know, he says, don't mistake that I'm angry at you, because one can only be angry with people he respects. And everybody has quoted that as, because obviously he didn't respect the press. But then later in the same press conference, he says to Pierpoint, he says, I don't want my friend from CBS to mistake what I'm saying. Reporters have a place in our system to ask questions. I was talking about columnists. In other words, he felt it was important enough in that moment where he's attacking columnists to say reporters have a role in the American system. The current president does not believe that reporters have a role in the current system other than to say what he tells them to say.
I want to take exception to something that both both of you have said, and that is this idea that Nixon respected the press or the role of the press. I don't think it's the case. If you listen to the tapes, there is a particularly important tape in which Nixon is in the Oval Office with Henry Kissinger, and he says to Kissinger, "Henry, remember this, the press is the enemy. Repeat, Henry, the press is the enemy. Henry, the press is the enemy. Write that on a blackboard 100 times. The press is the enemy." And that Nixon, indeed, tried to make the conduct of the press, especially at the Washington Post, especially Woodward, myself, Ben Bradley, Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, tried to make the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate, not the conduct of the president and his men. And now we see again that Trump has done exactly the same thing, knowing the disdain in which the press is held by so much of the country.
Don't disagree with you for a second. My point was that Nixon felt for his political future that he had to maintain some appearance of maintaining these norms in public, whereas the difference is he said the press is the enemy in private to Kissinger. Trump says it out loud repeatedly to the public. And that's the only delta I'm talking about is in terms of measuring the difference between the two. I think they, in their hearts, probably are like this. But Nixon, at least for whatever reason, at least maintain the norms and sometimes in public. But I don't disagree with you.
What I think where you're going that's really right is Nixon indeed would not challenge the democratic transfer of power. Once he knew that he had to leave, he left. Donald Trump did the opposite. He did not want to leave. He entered into a conspiracy, a seditious conspiracy to overturn a fair and democratic election of the President of the United States.
And Donald Trump does things in plain sight, to your point, and Richard Nixon was doing all the bad stuff behind the scenes. I want to read Carl's and Bob's. They did a new foreword to All the President's Men, which came out. It was the 50th anniversary, and so that was in 2024, right, Carl? So I'm just going to read this quickly. Watergate at 50 years. President George Washington, in his celebrated 1796 farewell address, cautioned that American democracy was fragile. Cunning, quote, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reign of government, he warned. Two of his successors, Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, demonstrate the shocking genius of our first president's foresight. As reporters, we had studied Nixon and written about him for nearly half a century, during which we believed with great conviction that never again would America have a president who would trample the national interests and succeed in undermining democracy through the audacious pursuit of personal and political self-interest. And then along came Trump. I mean, Carl, we can talk more about Trump versus Nixon. I think we could talk about that for days. But I wanted...
Well, the thing that Washington is saying there is one thing in this system that this new democracy cannot withstand, and that is when men, as he say, puts their personal interests above those of the nation. And he was also speaking about political parties at the time. And indeed, that is what we saw with this seditious president in trying to hold on to the office and overturn a free election, as Trump did.
I want to ask you about sort of your old employers, former employers. First, the Washington Post, Carl. It's been my hometown paper, an institution that once represented the very best of American journalism. Since the Graham family sold the paper to Jeff Bezos back in 2013, after more than 80 years of ownership, it's been through a series of seismic changes. Earlier this year, it cut roughly a third of its staff, and in many ways, it's become a symbol of the broader crisis facing the news industry. I'm curious how it feels for you to see the paper that set the foundation for your career face this moment.
Well, disappointing doesn't begin to describe it. And you know, for all of the years of Bezos's ownership of the Post, up until the last electoral year, Bezos enabled and allowed the Post to do absolutely fabulous reporting on Donald Trump. There was never a question of Bezos interfering in that reporting. He was a model owner in that respect until this last election, when he delivered this edict that the paper could not endorse a candidate or endorse Kamala Harris as the candidate. And Woodward and I made a statement on.
In fact, you said the decision to, in a rare public rebuke, both of you, you stated the decision, quote, ignores the Washington Post's own overwhelming repertorial evidence on the threat Donald Trump poses to democracy.
But what we're looking at now and what we're seeing, and this is a great era in some ways in terms of reporting, especially investigative reporting, including a good deal of reporting on Donald Trump. But it's also a terrible era in which journalistic institutions, ABC, others have capitulated.
CBS. Oh, I can't wait to have this conversation.
have capitulated to the intimidation of the President of the United States. And we haven't even begun to talk about self-censorship, which is, I'd like to ask you both. It seems to me is rampant.
Yes, I agree.
Self-censorship in the coverage of the Trump White House and of Trump is a scourge. So that we now have a situation, unlike in the era of Watergate, where the American press, or parts of it, and also institutions from colleges, universities, all kinds of institutions are bowing to the whim, not whims, to the fear of this President of the United States. And it is a reign of terror in which we are seeing, you know, institutions that we regard as bulwarks of democracy fold.
Which brings us to CBS. Listening to Carl talk about the Washington Post, it's hard not to think of the quote-unquote Tiffany Network, John. I worked there for 5 years. How long were you at CBS altogether?
16 years.
16 years, so much longer than I was. I have my own thoughts about this, but how would you describe, John, this moment at CBS?
Well, do you want to go to this moment at CBS, or do you want to talk about the $16 million pay off?
I consider that part of this moment.
Well, I think there are two things, and also in terms of my view. So what I said when I was there in an editorial for a broadcast that was called Evening News Plus, which came on after the Evening News, was that the $16 million payment had sort of was aimed directly at what our job is and the trust we're supposed to have with the audience.
I want to just really briefly explain the $16 million.
I'm sorry. Payment. Yes, thank you, Katie. You're very good at moderating. So Donald Trump made a claim that was that most of the people who looked at it who weren't being paid for him that had no merit, and this was that 60 Minutes had edited an interview with Kamala Harris to improve her answer, and he sued on this basis. The lawyers who looked at the claim and looked at the interview and looked at the pattern and practice, which is important here, of editing in news interviews, determined there was really nothing to this case. Nevertheless, because the Paramount deal had to be ratified by the FCC, and the administration, CBS settled the lawsuit with the president, and lo and behold, the merger was approved. When the merger was approved, I wrote this essay and delivered it on the air. And my point was, you can't pay $16 million to the person that you are supposed to hold accountable and have your viewers think you're serious in the job that you're doing. First of all, a $16 million payment is an affirmation of misinformation because the president's claims were without basis in fact, and they were an act of fiction. Our job as reporters is to pierce acts of fiction. So instead of piercing acts of fiction, we were paying $16 million to affirm an act of fiction. So that's directly at odds with the news, with the job of the news. The second thing it did is it raised doubt in the future, in the minds of viewers, for good reason, that we would be able to hold to account a president that the network had just paid $16 million to. And then finally, leave aside the White House. The message that was sent was, when it's business, these journalistic niceties that you have, forget them. $16 million gets the merger approved. We're going forward. Business is business. Okay. But then all the choices that are made in the evening news or that are made on other broadcasts, you've got in the back of your head not just, the questions about Donald Trump and how hard to be on him, but you're also got in the back of your head, when push comes to shove, business is going to decide. Business is going to make the judgment. So now you've got two things before you get to the editorial process, which is supposed to govern the news process. And the editorial process is fact-checking, getting double sources, having the fact-checking team at CBS was fantastic. I'm sure you had this happen to you, Katie. You wanted to say something, and they would come up to you and say, can't say that because it's this tiny little difference in what you wanted to say and what is actually the case. All of those structures, which are why people trust the news, those had been put third now in line behind business interests and then appealing to the presidency.
And that never happened like at NBC, the corporate, suits. I remember Bob Wright once wrote me an email. He was angry at a question I had asked Condoleezza Rice about Russia during an interview on the Today Show. And he said a lot of people had complained about my question. And I said, I won't get into your quarterly profits. Please stay out of my journalism. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's basically how it always was when these corporations started owning television networks, and the way it always should be. And then, you're talking about a moment in time, John, before the Ellisons came in, well-known, huge Trump supporters, and brought in Barry Weiss, who is also, not considered, has very ideological positions that are much more aligned with Donald Trump. And in fact, she said that news organizations lost the public's trust because they became too ideologically homogeneous, too reluctant to challenge their own assumptions, and too dismissive of viewpoints outside their own newsroom culture. I'm curious to get your reaction to that quote, both of you, Carl and...
Well, I think there is something to the charge, I think, that mainstream news organizations have not been sensitive enough historically to having in their newsrooms people of all kinds of political, social, demographics, backgrounds. That also includes not having enough working class people who are reporters in our newsroom. Well, we go on reporting about working class people and what's going on with them. We don't have any reporters who know anything about working class people. So I think there's something to that aspect. Also, I think it is possible for magazines, news of sorts, organizations that are ideologically aligned, I think it's perfectly possible for them to do some great stories. And they often do. The National Review will come up with something, the Atlantic, which occupies a certain political aspect of the
But aren't you
sphere.
talking about kinder, gentler times, Carl? I mean, people could debate policies with a Republican president, a Democratic president, conservative ideology versus liberal ideology, but doesn't it cross the line when you have someone who traffics in such lies as Donald Trump does? Isn't it a wholly different situation?
I don't know about wholly different, but look, Donald Trump has said that he is perhaps the most consequential president in the history of the United States. There's something to it. that what he has done in the first year of this second term in office is of such historic consequence that it's hard to think of any other presidential term or any other president that has brought about such wholesale sea change in who we are as a country, in our policies, in his grifting, in his graft, in his relationships with economic entities, his dealing with undermining democracy and the very basic principles of democracy. This is a consequential presidency, such as nothing that we have ever seen. So yeah, we're dealing in a new era. Look, Trump has dismantled the existing order of this country as going back before the New Deal. The whole post-war order of democracy, he has sought and succeeded in undermining. The same is true of the world order, that he has succeeded in doing what he believes he is entitled to do. So I think we need to be realistic about what Donald Trump has wrought, because it is astonishing. And the people who recognize it, among others, best in the world, are the leaders of the other Western democracies, who understand and have a view of Trump that is disdainful, that is fearful, that they don't know how to deal with him, that they humor him, that they are not at all sure of his abilities, of his mental state. This is where we are in terms of a different presidency of such consequence.
And consequential isn't necessarily good.
No.
Let me try and see if I can puzzle through the question of why the mainstream media has lost trust. So as Carl said, there is absolute trust. There's truth in the claim, for sure. There are just more liberals in newsrooms than conservatives. There was a sense of craft that, and also, by the way, these terms have changed significantly. What liberal and conservative means has changed a great deal from that age where the senators went to see Nixon, and you had Hugh Scott would never be in the Republican Party anymore. So you have, those terms have changed, and therefore making these judgments of the present to the past are a little tricky. But it is true, if you do not support abortion rights, you will not see yourself reflected in an evening news broadcast the way you do if you support abortion rights. If you are a person of religion, you will see your religiosity often covered as a kind of sociological oddity, as opposed to just a normal thing that people engage in their lives. And those kinds of messages over time have affected people's views about how liberal the news business is. That's just one element, though, of many of the things that have changed the trust equation. And just on the question of homogeneity, and replacing one kind of homogeneity with another kind of homogeneity is no change. So that's one of the, when people talk about a homogeneous news culture, that's fine. But if your change is just to replace it with the other team's homogeneity, then that's not a fix. I think there's another thing, though, that's a part of why the trust has dropped, is how many times have you seen a breaking news banner for something you've known about for 3 days? Listen to the language that is used on some news programs when they tell you the news. They'll say tonight, or they'll say tonight, just coming in, this news happening now exclusively on our air, that I have a glass in my hand. So what you feel is a massive, pay attention, let us freak you out, oh my God. And then when you hear the news, you're like, what was that all about?
The desperate cries of increasingly irrelevant anchors.
Yes. And so what happens is, yeah. So what happens is those two things, the breaking news and the desperate cries of increasingly irrelevant anchors, which are meant to say basically, pay attention, those are lies. Those are misrepresentations, right? It's not breaking. It's been around for 3 days. It's not urgent that I have a glass in my hand. So how can you say to people, we're going to give you the truth while you're simultaneously lying to them, right? There's a total disconnect. Now, just two more very quick points. There's also been, and we didn't talk about this with respect to Watergate, but if Fox News had been around, there probably would have been, if Nixon had 15 votes, he might have had a few more. If there had been an entire news organization working against you, both the facts you were presenting and also calling you out by name to go after you. So there's been, Fox's news model has been to discredit every other kind of news organization. There's that, and we also have the most powerful person in the world attacking the press out loud. When David Sanger asks a reasonable question, why is B going to follow from A? He calls him treasonous. So that's a part of the trust problem.
We've got a lot of things working against the media right now. We only have a minute left before we start the film, and I want to end on a more positive note, because I think the three of us really do feel that there is some extraordinary journalism going on now. It's just very different forms. If you look at ProPublica, which painstakingly tracked the people who were being incarcerated or deported, and showed that a very small percentage had actually committed serious crimes. If you look at the New Yorker, that basically in January, the number's much bigger now, painstakingly reported how much the Trump family and associates had enriched themselves to the tune of over $4 billion. And by the way, that was 6 months ago. So
well, there's now a model for local news that is absolutely fabulous. The Texas Tribune, Andy Lack's paper in Mississippi. There now is really serious reporting going on by nonprofit news organizations that are breaking stories all across the country. You've also got to look around the world at the courageous reporters in Russia, especially. There's great reporting going on, and by and large, it's not necessarily being done by the old legacy
organizations. Anything give you hope, John, in closing?
Oh yeah, I would just, Bob and Carl would make 17 phone calls to find one person. They'd go to their house. The phones have changed. They're not rotary, but the great reporters out there are still making 17 phone calls. They're still doorstepping. They are still working patiently while everybody's moved on, while people like me are jumping around having thousands of opinions. They're quietly doing the hard work, which is lonely work, and their editors are saying, go do that hard, lonely work, stay on the phones, and they produce amazing journalism, which is then our job to hold on to and to not get distracted by support financially, not get distracted by the shiny objects and a presidency that is designed for distraction. And then I would just say one other thing, which is there are the amazing individual reporters that are spending 17 phone calls trying to get one tiny fact confirmed. But there are also a lot of editors and producers and people in news and independent journalists as well now on Substack who are paying attention, who are not flitting around, because you not only have the president distracting, but you have the best minds of Silicon Valley and 1/3 of the S&P working on keeping us distracted. And there are people who are saying, no, our attention needs to stay on these issues that are important because they're important to the country, to mankind, and to our democracy. And those are amazing, hopeful things, which all go right back to this film. The same values exist in the world, and so that's what gives me hope.
Well, that is a perfect segue to say, John and Carl, thank you so much. Carl, thank you for coming to Aspen. I know it wasn't easy for you to get here. John, thank you for being part of this conversation, and please enjoy All the President's Men. Thank you all.
Thank you.